For 3 years, my husband sent me money from California. $14 on the first of every month, and a letter with it. And the letter always said the same thing. The work was steady, the heat was fierce. Kiss the children for me. Then one morning in June of 1936, I laid the money order and the envelope side by side on the kitchen table and saw that the order had been bought in Fresno and the letter postmarked in Bakersfield, and that between those two towns lay 110 miles of valley that no man could cross twice on a Sunday. My husband had not written that letter. My husband had not bought that order. My husband had been dead since the August of '33, and there were people who had known it every single month while they took my thanks and my prayers and answered them in his hand. But let me start at the beginning, because if I begin at the end, you will hate the wrong people, and I want you to hate them in the right order, the way I came to.
Before we go on, tell me in the comments where you're listening from tonight.
It always amazes me how far these stories travel, and I like to think of you out there, in your kitchen or your car or with the light down low. Now settle in. This one takes a while, and it is worth the sitting. My name is Nell Bickford, and in the spring of 1932, we had 160 acres in Meade County, Kansas, that my grandfather broke with a walking plow, and that my father held through 2 bad decades by refusing, on principle, to want anything. The house faced east because my grandmother wanted the sun in the kitchen before it got mean, and it had 4 rooms and a porch that ran the whole width of the front, and a cellar under the north side where we kept what we canned. I was 31 that spring. My daughter Clemmy was 7, and my son Foy was 3. And my husband, Orrin, was 34 years old and had hands like 2 flat irons and a way of standing in a doorway with his hat still on, half in and half out, as if the outside had one more thing to tell him. There is a way of living that is poor without being pitiful, and that is how we lived. We had milk, and we had eggs, and we had a smokehouse with something in it. I made the children's clothes out of the printed sacks the flour came in, and there was a season when every girl in the Baptist church at Fowler had a dress out of the same blue and white pattern, and they lined up in the pew like a set of dishes. Orrin kept the machinery running with baling wire and a temper. When the wheat came off good, we bought shoes. When it did not, we resold. I did not think of us as suffering. I thought of us as farming, and those 2 words had not yet come to mean the same thing. Our mornings had an order to them, and I loved that order more than I ever said out loud. I got up first, always, because the stove was mine and the dark was quiet, and for 20 minutes the house belonged to me. I would light the kerosene lamp and set it on the shelf over the dry sink and get the fire going, and the kindling would catch with that little rush of sound, like something taking a breath. And then I would grind the coffee. We drank Arbuckles, and the coffee came in a tin with a red band around it, and when the tin was empty, I kept it, because a woman on a farm keeps everything with a lid. That is a detail I want you to hold on to. The tin will come back. Orrin came in about 10 minutes after the smell reached the bedroom. He did that his whole life. He said he could not wake up on purpose, only by ambush, and coffee was the only thing that ever managed it. He would come through the door in his socks with his shirt half buttoned and stand there in the doorway with his hat already on, which drove me to distraction, and I would say, "Orrin, you cannot wear a hat in my kitchen." And he would say, "I am not wearing it. I am carrying it on my head." That was a joke between us for 11 years, and it never got any better, and I never once failed to laugh at it. Now, when I remember him, I do not remember the wedding or the hospital or the good year we had in '28. I remember the hat and the doorway and how the light came around him. The children came out after. Clemmy first because she was the kind of child who woke up already talking. Then Foy dragging the quilt he would not surrender until he was 5.
I fed them oatmeal with sorghum, and Orrin took his coffee standing up at the counter, looking out the east window at the ground, which he did every single morning of his life, like a man reading a letter he had already read and hoped had changed. We had $240 of debt at the bank in Meade against the tractor, and a note at the implement dealer, and neither of those was strange in that county. Everyone we knew was carrying something. It was 1932. The whole country was carrying something, and the ones who claimed they were not had simply moved theirs where you could not see it. I want to tell you about the day the ground went, because you cannot understand what came after unless you understand what it did to a man like Orrin. The wind had blown all that spring, and by April, the ground in the west section had started to walk. That is the only way I know to say it. The topsoil got so dry and so fine that it did not blow away like dust. It moved like water, and it piled against the fences in drifts the color of a paper sack. And on the worst days, the sun came up looking like a bad penny, and by noon you could not see the barn from the porch. I hung wet sheets over the windows. I put damp cloths over the children's faces at night. In the morning, there would be a print of Foy's head on the pillow in clean white with dirt all around it, like the shape of a boy laid into the ground. And I could not look at it. And I made the bed fast and did not tell anybody, not even Orrin, that it made my hands cold. Orrin stopped talking that year. Not entirely, not in a way a stranger would have noticed. But he had been a man who narrated, who told you what he was going to do and then told you how it went. And that dried up in him the same season the ground did. He would come in at dusk with his eyelashes packed with dirt and sit down and eat and go to bed. Once I found him standing in the west section at 9 at night, just standing there. And when I came out to him with the lamp, he said, "It is going to Oklahoma." And I said, "What is?" And he said, "Ours. It is going down to Oklahoma, and theirs is going to Arkansas. And by fall, there won't be a man in this country who can say what he is standing on." He laughed after he said it, and the laugh was worse than the sentence. In September of 32, 2 things happened close together. The wheat made 4 bushels to the acre, which is not a crop. It is an apology. And a man named Curtis Ryland came through Fowler with a Ford truck and a chest full of handbills and stood on the running board outside the feed store telling anybody who would listen that the Metropolitan Water District of Southern California was going to dig an aqueduct 240 miles across the desert from the Colorado River, that there were tunnels to be driven and rock to be shot and men were needed, and the pay was $5 a day. $5 a day. I want you to sit with that number a minute, because in Meade County in 1932, a hired man got $1 and his dinner. And here was a man in a clean hat saying 5, and sang it in the street in daylight where everybody could hear him say it. Orrin came home that night and did not eat. He sat down at the kitchen table with his hat on and put both hands flat on the wood and said, "Nell, I want you to hear me out before you say anything." And I knew. Wives know the shape of a sentence before it is finished. The way you know a wagon is coming by the change in the dogs. I sat down across from him and put my hands in my lap where he could not see them. He talked for a long time. He said the ground would come back, but not this year and not next. He said the note on the tractor did not care about the weather. He said if he went out in October, he could be back by wheat harvest with $300, $400 if the tunnel work held, and that we could clear the bank and put in a row of trees on the north to break the wind, and that other men were going,
Dutch Ostrander was going. The Castile brothers were going. He said it very evenly, and he had clearly practiced it on the drive home. And about 2/3 of the way through, I understood that he was not asking me. He was telling me in the form of a question because he was a decent man, and that was the only way he knew to do it without shame. So I said the thing I have gone over 10,000 times since. I said, "All right." I said, "Take the good coat." If I had said no, he would have stayed. I know that about him. He would have stayed and hated it and been kind to me anyway. And we would have lost the tractor and probably the North 80, and we would have gone to my sister's in Hutchinson. And Orrin Bickford would be an old man right now with dirt under his nails, complaining about the government. I have had to make my peace with that. I have not entirely made it. I have made the kind of peace you make with a neighbor whose dog killed your hens, a working peace, a peace with a fence in it. He left on the 14th of October, 1932. I have the date because I wrote it on the wall inside the pantry door in pencil, the way I wrote all our dates, the children's heights, and the day the well was deepened, and the day my father died. He took one grip, the good coat, 2 pairs of boots, and $11. He rode as far as Dodge with Dutch Ostrander, and from there they were going to catch on with a truckload of men headed southwest. Clemmy cried. Foy did not understand and asked for 3 days after when Daddy was coming in for supper. And Orrin stood in the doorway of my kitchen with his hat on his head and said, "I'm not wearing it, I'm carrying it." And I laughed with my face wet. And that was the last time I ever saw my husband alive. And the last thing I ever said to him was, "Go on then, before I change my mind." The first letter came 11 days later, from Needles, California, and it was 4 lines long and said they were on, and the country out there was the ugliest thing God ever made. The second came from a camp on the desert with a return address that was just a post office box in Indio, and it had $4 in it, which is not much until you have counted the coins in a coffee tin the night before. In December, there were $12. In February, 16. He wrote every month, sometimes twice, and the letters were short because he was not a writing man, and they had the shape of a man's speech in them. And I read them at the table with the lamp pulled close, and then I read them again in bed. I will tell you exactly what those letters did in my house, because it matters to everything that comes after. They kept us. Not the money. The money kept the bank quiet, but the letters kept us. On the first Saturday of the month, I would drive the wagon into Fowler and go into the post office, and Wendell Pace would look up from behind the grill and get that pleased look on his face and say, "Well now, Miss Bickford, I believe there is something here for you." And he would take his time about it, the way a man does when handing over good news is the best part of his week. And I would carry it out to the wagon and not open it there because the children were watching. And we had a ritual. We drove out past the schoolhouse and stopped, and I read it out loud to Clemmy and Foy, all of it, twice. And then Clemmy held it, and then it went in the Arbuckle tin on the shelf over the dry sink. 3 years of first Saturdays, 30-some letters. My children learned to read on their father's sentences, and by the time Foy was 6, he could recite the ending of every one of them, because Orrin ended them all the same way. "Kiss them for me, and mind the wind." That was our whole life for 3 years, and I need you to understand that it was not a sad life. It was a life with a hole in it that we all agreed to walk around, and we got good at walking around it. And there is a kind of contentment in that which I did not know a person could have, and which I have never entirely gotten back. The money came steady from the spring of '33 onward, $14, the first of the month, regular as the moon. In August of 33, the letters changed a little. The hand got neater, more slanted, easier to read. And there was a line in that first neat letter that I have thought about more than any other sentence in my life. It said, "I mashed my right hand between two cars of muck and cannot hold a pencil worth anything, so I am getting a fellow in the camp to set down what I say. He is a school teacher out of Missouri and does not charge me." And I remember sitting at that table with the lamp and feeling nothing but tenderness, nothing but a warm ache all through my chest, for my husband with his hand hurt and his pride hurt worse, dictating a letter to a school teacher out of Missouri. That is how they did it. That is the whole trick right there, and it was a good one, and it worked on me for 2 years and 10 months. I have had to admit that it worked because it was aimed at exactly the place in me that loved him. Nobody ever fooled anybody with a clumsy lie. They fool you with a lie that is kind to you. Now I am going to tell you about Wendell Pace and about my husband's sister Verna, and I am going to tell you about them the way they looked to me then, not the way they look to me now, because otherwise you will not believe how long I let it go on. Wendell Pace ran the post office at Fowler out of the front third of a hardware building, behind a brass grill with a sliding wooden shutter, and he had run it since 1919. He was a widower of about 55, soft in the middle, a whistler, a man who kept peppermints in a jar and gave them to children while looking at their mothers to be sure the giving was noticed. He was the second most informed man in the county after the doctor, and he knew it, and he carried the knowing lightly and pleasantly. When my father died, he came out to the place in his own automobile with a ham. When the dust was at its worst, he came out twice to see if we needed anything hauled. He asked after Orrin every single time I came in, by name, with the details right. Was he still on the tunnel? Was the hand any better? And there is no way I can make you feel how much that was worth to a woman alone on a section in 1934, to have one man in town who remembered that your husband existed. Verna was Orrin's older sister, and she had gone out to California in 1928 with a man named Grady Spears who sold auto parts and did not marry her, and she landed in Bakersfield and stayed. She was 41 in 1932, and she was a handsome woman with a hard mouth, and she had opinions about everything and no patience for the length of anybody's sentence but her own. She and I got along the way two women get along who both love the same difficult man, and neither one thinks the other is doing it right. But when Orrin went out there in October of 32, Verna was the whole reason I could stand it. She was there. She wrote me a letter in November of 32, the only long letter she ever wrote me, and it said, "Nell, I have got eyes on him. He came through here Sunday and ate 2 plates, and I made him take a blanket, and you are not to lie awake." For 3 years, when I thought of my husband out in that country among strange men, I thought of Verna standing in a doorway in Bakersfield, making him take a blanket, and it let me sleep. That is what she gave me. And I want to say plainly before we go one step further that Verna Bickford knew on the 11th of August, 1933, that her brother was dead under 9 feet of rock in a tunnel heading east of Hayfield, California, because she was the one who signed for his effects. She knew it when she wrote me the letter that came the following month. She knew it every first Saturday for 34 months, while a woman in Kansas read her lies out loud to 2 children beside a schoolhouse, and then folded them and put them in a coffee tin. But I did not know any of that in the summer of 36. In the summer of 36, I knew only that something in the arithmetic had started to itch, and the itch began, as these things do, with a thing so small I nearly threw it in the stove. It was the last Saturday in May, 1936, and I was standing at the window of the post office filling out a card to send to my sister when Wendell Pace put my mail through the grill, and I saw that the money order was the wrong color. That is all it was. The postal orders had always come on a yellowish paper, and this one was closer to buff, and there was a printed line across the bottom that the others did not have. I stood there in the middle of a hot room with a pen in my hand and thought about it for 2 seconds and decided the government had changed its paper, which was true, as it happened, and had nothing to do with anything. But I had looked at it. That was the trouble. In 3 years, I had never once looked at the order itself. I had looked at the amount, and I had signed the back, and I had thought about the letter the entire time, the way you look at a plate while your mind is on the person who cooked it. Now I had looked, and the eye is a bad servant. Once it has learned to look at a thing, it will keep on looking whether you asked it to or not. At home that night, after the children were down, I took the tin off the shelf and sat at the table with the lamp and did something I had never done, which was read the letters in a row. All of them, start to finish, 34 of them, the way you would read a book. It took me until the clock struck 1, and I want to be honest about why I did it, because it was not suspicion. It was loneliness. It was a Saturday in May, and I was 35 years old, and my husband had been gone 3 years and 7 months. And I wanted the sound of him for a while. That was all. I made a pot of coffee at 11 o'clock at night like a fool, and I sat there and read my husband's voice out of 34 pieces of paper. And by the 20th letter, I had stopped hearing him. I cannot tell you the exact place it went wrong, and that is what a good forgery is. It does not fail anywhere in particular. It just gradually stops being the man. Orrin said, "Kiss them for me, and mind the wind." All of them said that. That was right. But Orrin never in his life said the word grand about anything, and there it was in the letter from March of 35. The country up north is grand. Orrin called our daughter Clem. Every letter from August of 33 forward called her Clemmy, which is what I called her, which is what a woman would call her. Orrin never asked a question in a letter, not once in the first 10 months, because he was not a man who asked. He was a man who reported and waited. And from 34 on, there were questions in every one. Warm little questions. How is the North 80? Is Foy in the school yet? Has Pace still got that awful jar of candy? And I sat there in my own kitchen at 1 o'clock in the morning with my hands going cold in the heat of a Kansas May, and I said out loud to nobody, "He is asking me things he could not care less about." Then I did what people do. I explained it. That is the part of myself I have had the hardest time forgiving, and I have talked to enough women since to know that every single one of us does it, and that it is not stupidity. It is love keeping house. I told myself that a man dictating a letter to a school teacher out of Missouri would naturally sound like a school teacher out of Missouri. That the school teacher was probably the one saying grand. That a man 3 years gone from his children would of course start asking about them. That it was growth. That it was the sort of thing that happens to a man alone in a desert with time to think. I built that explanation in about 4 minutes, and it was a good one. It was sound. You could have hung a gate on it. And I put the letters back in the tin and went to bed and slept badly, and did not think about it again for 11 days. I would like to tell you that I am the kind of woman who acts on a bad feeling. I am not. I am the kind who writes it down and waits. And I did that. That is the only thing I did right that spring. In the pantry, on the inside of the door where I kept our dates in pencil, under Foy 7 years, 4 feet 1 inch, I wrote, May 30th. Letters not like him after August 33.
It looked like nothing. It looked like a note about laundry. 11 days later, it was the only piece of ground I had to stand on. The 11 days were ordinary, and I will pass over most of them, except to say that the ground had come back a little that year. We had a rain in April that ran in the ditches, and the wheat in the south section stood up green and thick enough that I walked out into it one evening and could not see my own shoes. And I cried about it, which I had not done over anything else in 3 years. Clemmy was 11 that summer, and had got tall and mouthy and helpful all at once. Foy was 7 and had his father's way of standing in a doorway. There was a boy from the Castile place who came around to help me with the mowing for the use of our sorghum press. And if you are thinking that I was lonely enough to be foolish, I will tell you plainly that I was lonely enough to be foolish, and that I was not foolish, and that the reason was a coffee tin with 34 letters in it. A woman with a husband writing to her every month is not a widow, and she does not behave like one, and there were people who were counting on exactly that. On the first Saturday in June, I drove into Fowler, and Window Pace put an envelope and a money order through the grill and said what he always said, and I said what I always said, and I got out to the wagon, and Foy asked, could he hold it, and I said not yet, and I looked at the order because now I looked at the order, and it had been bought at the post office in Fresno, California, on the 29th of May. The envelope was postmarked Bakersfield, California, the 30th of May. Now, understand, I had never had a reason on this earth to know how far it was from Fresno to Bakersfield. Kansas people do not carry California in their heads. But we had a Rand McNally in the front room that had come with a set of encyclopedias my father bought from a man in 1911 and never opened. And that night after supper, I got it down and put my thumb on Bakersfield and my finger on Fresno, and read the little numbers along the road, and it was 110 miles, and I sat back in the chair. A man could do it. That was my first thought, and I want to be fair to myself and say it was not an unreasonable one. A man could ride up to Fresno on a Friday with somebody, buy an order, and be back in Bakersfield to mail a letter Saturday. Men did stranger things than that every day for less reason. But then I got up and went and got the tin, and I sat down on the floor in the front room with the lamp on the seat of the chair, and I went through every money order stub I had kept, because I had kept them all, because a woman on a farm keeps everything with a number on it. March of 34, bought at Modesto. April, Bakersfield. May, Tulare. June, Fresno. September of 35, Stockton. And on, up and down that valley, and every letter that came with them postmarked Bakersfield, 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 31 times out of 34, in a hand that started to slant in August of 33. I did not cry. This surprised me at the time. What I did was get very, very cold, sitting on the floor of my own front room in June in Kansas with the windows open, cold all the way up through my back and into my jaw, and my ears filled up with a sound like the sound in a shell. The lamp was on the chair seat, about a foot from my face, and I remember watching the flame lean and thinking, in the flat voice you use for the truth, he is not the one mailing these. Somebody is mailing these from one place and buying the orders wherever they happen to be, and the somebody has been doing it since August of 33. And the somebody signs off, kiss them for me, and mind the wind, because the somebody has read the first 10 letters. And then, because the mind will do anything to keep from arriving,
I found a way to make it hopeful. That is the cruelest thing the mind does. I thought, he is hurt. His hand is worse than he said, or it is not his hand at all, and he has been laid up somewhere all this time, and Verna has been seeing to the money and to the letters so as not to frighten me. That is not a betrayal. That is a kindness that went on too long. He is alive in a bed in Bakersfield, and his sister has been sparing me.
And I got up off the floor, and I made myself a cup of coffee at 10 o'clock at night for the second time in 2 weeks. And I drank it standing up at the counter looking out the east window at the ground the way he used to. And I decided I would write to Verna and ask her straight out, and that I would be gentle with her, because she had probably been carrying something heavy alone. I wrote that letter on the 8th of June, and I have a copy of it because I wrote it twice, once angry, which I burned in the stove, and once gentle, which I kept the draft of. It said, "Verna, I am not accusing you of one thing, but I have looked at 3 years of money orders and they do not come from where the letters come from, and the letters have not sounded like Orrin since August of '33. If he is hurt worse than he has let on, I want to know it, and I want to know it from you, and I will not carry on nor blame anybody, but I have a right to it, and so do his children. Write me back by return mail." I mean that, Verna, by return mail. I took it in to Fowler on the 9th, and here is where I have to tell you what happened at the grill, because at the time it was a small thing, and afterward it was the whole case. Wendell Pace took my letter, looked at the address, and his face did something. It was nothing you could put in a court. It was a stillness about half a second long, the way a dog goes quiet before it decides. And then he was pleasant again, and he weighed it and stamped it and said, "Bakersfield. Well, I expect Verna will be glad to hear from home." And I said, "I expect she will." And he said, and I did not think one thing about it for 6 days, he said, "You want to give a letter to California 10 days, Ms. Bickford. 2 weeks even. Mail don't run out there like it does back here." I said, "Thank you, Wendell," and I drove home. Now, 10 days is a long time to a woman who has just found out that her husband may be lying in a bed somewhere with his hand crushed, and I did not have 10 days in me. I had 4. On the 13th of June, which was a Saturday, I drove back in with the children to buy salt and a sack of chick feed, and while Clemmy was at the counter, I went across to the post office and asked Wendell had anything come, and he said no, and I asked if he was sure, and he said, "Ms. Bickford, I would not tease you about that." And then I did something I had never done in my life. I did not leave. I stood at the grill and I said, "Wendell, do you know anything about my husband that I do not know?" The room was hot, and the ceiling fan was turning, and there was a boy behind me waiting to buy a stamp. Wendell Pace put both his hands flat on the counter on his side of the grill and looked at them, and he was quiet for what I would swear in front of a judge was 4 full seconds. And then he raised his face, and it was full of a kind of sorrow that I mistook entirely, and he said, "I know that a man who goes out there sometimes finds it is easier not to come back than to come back with nothing. I have seen it half a dozen times out of this county. It ain't always a thing anybody done wrong. It is just distance now." It was the first time in 17 years that he had used my given name. I went out of there with my ears ringing again and got into the wagon and sat there in the sun on the square in Fowler, Kansas, and let a thought come all the way up that I had been holding under water for 2 weeks, which was, he has another woman out there, and everybody in this town knows it but me. And the humiliation of that came over me so hot that I could not swallow. And Clemmy came out with the salt and said, "Mama, what is the matter?" And I said the light was bad, and drove us home and did not speak the whole way. And my daughter, who was 11, put her hand on my arm at the section corner and left it there for 2 miles. That was the 13th of June. On the 15th, I did the thing that started everything moving. And I did it in about the least dramatic way it is possible to do anything. I sat down at my kitchen table, and I wrote 3 letters, and I addressed them, and I put them in my apron pocket instead of taking them to Wendell Pace. And on the 16th, I drove 19 miles to Meade, in the wrong direction, past 2 post offices, and mailed them from the window of a post office where nobody knew my face. I did not know why I did it. That is the truth, and I have never dressed it up. I had no theory about Wendell. If you had asked me that morning, I would have said he was the kindest man in Fowler. Something in me had simply gotten tired of handing my life through a hole in a brass grill to a man who had said, "You want to give it 10 days?" about a letter he had not yet put on a train. The first letter went to Verna again, saying the same thing, colder. The second went to the Metropolitan Water District of Southern California at their offices in Los Angeles, and it said, "I am the wife of Orrin Bickford, who has been employed on your aqueduct since November of 1932, and I have not had direct word from him in some while, and I am asking for confirmation of his employment and where he is presently working." The third went to the head office of Woodmen of the World, because Orrin had carried a $1,000 benefit certificate with that society since we were married. $4.25 every quarter, paid up through 1932, and I assumed paid by him ever since out there. I asked whether his certificate was in good standing, and to what address the notices were being sent. 3 envelopes, 19 miles the wrong way, 6 cents. I want you to know that when I dropped those in the slot at Meade, I was still in my heart expecting to be told that my husband was living with a woman in Bakersfield and had been too much of a coward to say so. I had spent 2 weeks preparing myself to be a woman whose husband had left her. I had gone over it at night. I had decided I would not beg. I had decided the children would not hear it from me. I had gotten myself ready for that particular pain, the way you get ready for a cold room, and I was almost proud of how ready I was. There is a mercy in not knowing what is coming. I did not know that I had just mailed the 3 letters that would tell me my husband had died on the 11th of August, 1933, 16 days after his last letter in his own hand, and that at the moment I was sliding them through the brass slot in Meade, Kansas, the woman who had signed for his hat and his good coat and his $11 had a parlor set on time payments in a rented house on Kentucky Street in Bakersfield, and had gone that spring to San Francisco on the train. The answer from the Metropolitan Water District came to Meade on the 25th of June, 1936, because I had told them to hold it there for me, general delivery, and I had told them that in the letter without letting myself examine why. I want to describe that afternoon carefully, because it is the hinge of my life, and because the parts of it I remember are not the parts you would expect. I remember that the wagon seat was too hot to sit on, and I had to put a feed sack down. I remember that Foy wanted a peppermint, and I said no, sharp, and then bought him one out of guilt, and that he ate it looking sideways at me. I remember that the clerk in Meade was a young man with a boil on his neck who had to look through the general delivery box twice, and that while he looked, I read a notice on the wall about postal savings 4 separate times, all the way through, without any of it entering my head. The envelope had a printed corner card, blue, with the district's name and an address on Sunset Boulevard in Los Angeles. It was thin. That is what I noticed with my hands before my eyes had done anything at all. It was thin,
And a letter that has employment records in it is not thin. I took it out to the wagon, and I told Clemmy to take her brother across to the drugstore and buy him a nickel's worth of something and stay there till I came. And my daughter looked at my face and did not argue with me, which she had never once failed to do in 11 years. Then I sat on a feed sack in the sun on the square in Meade, Kansas, and opened it with my thumb, and it tore crooked. I did not read it in order. Nobody reads that kind of letter in order. My eye went to the middle of it and picked up the word regret, and then it went to the bottom and picked up a name and a title. And then it came back up to the top and started over like a horse that has shied. The letter was 5 sentences long. It said that Orrin L. Bickford had been employed by a contractor of the district as a mucker in Heading 4 east of the Hayfield Tunnel section. It said that he had been killed in a fall of ground on the 11th of August, 1933. It said that his personal effects and his final wages in the sum of $31.60 had been released on the 19th of August, 1933, to a sister, Miss Verna Bickford of Bakersfield, who had signed the receipt, and that the district's records showed no wife. And it said in the last line, in the tone of a man in an office who has done this before, that the district regretted the delay in the information and would be pleased to furnish a copy of the coroner's finding if the writer would state her interest. State her interest. Here is what my body did, and I am going to tell it plain because I promised myself I would. My hands did not shake. My hands went completely still, which was worse, and the paper hung out of them without any tremble at all. There was a taste in my mouth like a mouthful of pennies. My back went wet from the neck down in about 2 seconds, all at once, the way a bucket goes over, and I remember being astonished at the amount of it in the heat. And then a sound started in my ears, that shell sound, and it got so loud that when a man drove a truck across the square in front of me, I could not hear it. I watched a truck cross my whole field of vision without any noise. I sat with my dead husband's employment record in my lap in the sun and watched a silent truck go by and thought, with perfect clarity, the following thing. 3 Christmases. That is what came. Not the tunnel, not the rock, not August of 33. 3 Christmases. Because on Christmas Eve of 33 and 34 and 35, I had sat those children down and read them a letter from their father, and they had said goodnight to him out loud through the window in the direction they believed California to be, which is a thing Clemmy started when she was 8 and which Foy would not go to bed without. And I had stood behind them in the dark of my own house and let them do it. Somebody had written those Christmas letters. Somebody had sat down with a pen in a lit room and thought about what a dead man would say to his children at Christmas, and had put in a line about the desert being no place for snow, and had made me read it aloud to them, and had taken my 2 children's good nights through a window and out across 900 miles to a hole in the ground in Riverside County, California, where their father had been lying for 4 months by the first one. That is when I made a noise. It was not crying. I do not know what it was, and neither did the man tying his mule up in front of the bank, who came over and asked if I was ill. And I said I was fine, thank you. And he stood there a second and then went away because there is nothing to be done with a woman who says she is fine in that voice. I got the children. I drove home 19 miles. I do not remember 1 foot of that road. When we got to the house, I put Clemmy in charge of supper, which had never happened before, and I walked out into the south section, into the wheat, which was chest high on me by then, and green as anything. And I got out into the middle of it where the house was out of sight, and I stood there and let it come. I will not lay out for you everything I said out there, because some of it was to God, and some of it was to Orrin. and none of it was fit for a parlor. But the thing I came back to over and over, standing in a wheat field in the last of the light, was, he died on the 11th of August, and I did not know. He died at 10 or 11 in the morning California time, which is noon here, and I was in my kitchen at noon on the 11th of August, 1933, and I have thought, and I cannot bring back one thing about that day. Not one. There was no cold hand on my neck. The lamp did not go out. I have been told by women who mean well that a wife feels it. And I want to say to you, as somebody who has been on the other side of that particular idea, no, she does not. I felt nothing. I made dinner. And 3 days later, on the 14th, I got a letter he had written the week before in his own hand, and I read it out loud to my children by the schoolhouse and thought my husband was alive. I came in from the field when it was full dark. The children were asleep, which is its own small mercy, because I do not think I could have kept my face right. I lit the lamp and set it on the kitchen table and got down the Arbuckle tin and took out every letter that had come after the 11th of August, 1933, and laid them out on that table in rows. And there were 31 of them, and I sat and looked at them for a long time, the way you would look at a field of somebody else's stones. Then I went to the pantry door with the pencil, and I wrote under the line I had written in May, June 25th, killed August 11th, 1933, tunnel, Hayfield, California. Verna signed. And I stood there with the lamp in my hand, and I said out loud in an ordinary voice in an empty kitchen, "So that is what you have been doing, Verna." And that, friends, is the moment the woman who had spent 2 weeks getting ready to be left by her husband stopped existing and was replaced by somebody I had never met, who was a good deal harder and quite a lot more use. I did not sleep that night, but I did not lie in the dark either. I got a tablet and a pencil, and I sat at the kitchen table, and I wrote out everything I knew, in order, with dates, the way my father used to keep his accounts, and by 4 in the morning I had 4 pages, and I had understood 4 things. The first was that somebody had been sending me $14 a month for 34 months. That is $476. Nobody on this earth sends a woman $476 out of pity. People do not commit themselves to a monthly payment for 3 years to spare somebody's feelings. That money was rent. Somebody was paying rent on my ignorance, which meant my ignorance was worth more to them than $476, which meant there was money, real money, more money than I had ever had my hands on, somewhere in this thing. The second was the certificate. Orrin had carried a $1,000 benefit certificate with the Woodmen of the World since the year we were married, and I was named on it, and the dues were $4.25 every quarter. In a house like mine, that is not a small item. That is 9 or 10 dozen eggs. I had always known about it the way you know about a well you do not drink from. And I sat there at 4 in the morning and thought, a certificate does not pay itself. If the dues had lapsed after August of 33, the society would have written to somebody about it. And if the dues had not lapsed, then somebody had been paying $4.25 every quarter on a dead man's certificate for 3 years. And there is only one reason in the world to do that. The third thing was window pace. It went through me like a splinter you find with your thumb. In 3 years and 8 months, not one letter had ever come to my house from the Woodmen of the World. Not a notice, not a receipt, not a dues card, not a calendar. And they send calendars. Nothing had ever come from the Water District. Nothing had ever come from the coroner of Riverside County, California, and the coroner of a county where a man is killed rights to somebody.
Nothing had ever come from Dutch Ostrander, who left this county in the same truck as my husband, and who came home in the fall of '34, and who has never, not once, at church or at a sale or on the road, looked me in the eye. Every piece of mail that had ever come to me about my husband's life had come through a brass grill in Fowler, Kansas, and had been handed to me by a soft man with a jar of peppermints who once told me that mail did not run out there like it does back here. The fourth thing I understood was the worst one, and it was arithmetic, and it took me until the sky went gray to see it. If Orrin died on the 11th of August, 1933, then the certificate was payable on that date. I did not know the rules of the society, but my father had been a modern woodman in his day, and I had heard him talk, and I had a memory. Vague, the kind of memory you would not swear to, of the old men on the porch of the Fowler store saying that a claim against the society was barred if it was not brought within 3 years, and that this was a hard rule and had cost a family at Plains their money in the 20s. 3 years from the 11th of August, 1933. I got up and looked at the calendar hanging by the stove, the one from the implement dealer with a picture of a girl on a swing, and I counted the days with my finger, and I was standing in my kitchen in my nightgown at 4:30 in the morning on the 26th of June, 1936, and I had 46 days. 46 days to prove that a man was dead, that I was his wife, that I had never been notified, and that the money he had left his children had gone somewhere it had no business going. 46 days from a farm in Meade County, Kansas, to an office in Omaha, Nebraska, against a woman in California who had been lying about it since before Foy started school, with the mail running through Window Pace's hands. I made the coffee. I stood at the east window and drank it, looking at the ground the way Orrin used to. And when the sun came up over the Castile place, I went in and woke my daughter and said, "Clemmy, get up. You are going to your Aunt Sylvie's in Hutchinson for a while, and you are taking your brother." She sat up in the bed with her hair every direction and looked at me and said, "Mama, is Daddy dead?" 11 years old. Not is something wrong, not what has happened, not why. Straight to it, in a flat little voice like a woman of 40. I have wondered ever since how long she had been holding that question, and whether she had been holding it since the day she noticed her father had started calling her Clemmy in his letters, which is what I called her, and which she had once. I remembered it standing there in the doorway, and it went through me like a knife. Which she had once said out loud at the schoolhouse when she was 9, that it was funny Daddy had started saying Clemmy. I sat down on the edge of my daughter's bed, and I told her the truth, because I had just found out what happens to people who are managed for their own good. I said, "Yes, since before your 9th birthday. Somebody has been writing us letters, and I'm going to find out who, and I'm going to take everything they have got." She did not cry. She put her hand on top of mine, my little, tall, bony girl, and she said, "Take his coat back, too." And I want you to know that until she said it, I had not once thought about the coat, and that from that morning to this day, I have never been able to think about anything else for very long. Merritt Sharp had an office over the bank in Meade, with a window that would not stay up and a green shade with a water stain shaped like Illinois, and he was 61 years old and had been the kind of lawyer a small county produces. Wills, deeds, one divorce every other year, and 40 years of knowing exactly who was lying. I had never been in a lawyer's office in my life. I had put on my good dress and my mother's hat, which was 8 years out of style,
and I sat down in a chair in front of his desk and put the water district's letter and 11 money order stubs and 4 pages of tablet paper in front of him, and I said, "I have got 45 days, and I will pay you out of what we get and nothing before, and if you will not take it that way, tell me now and I will go on to Dodge." He read the whole thing without saying a word. He read the tablet pages twice. Then he took off his glasses and rubbed the 2 red marks on the sides of his nose and said, "Mrs. Bickford, do you know what your best piece of paper is here?" I said, "The letter from the district." He said, "No, ma'am. It is that pantry door. You wrote down on the 30th of May that the letters had not sounded like your husband since August of 1933. And you wrote it before you had any earthly idea he was dead. There is not a lawyer in Kansas can buy that. Whoever is on the other end of this is going to say you knew all along, and you have come around at the last minute for the money. That pencil mark is what makes you honest. Now, can that door be taken off its hinges and carried into a courtroom?" I said it could. He sent 3 telegrams that afternoon, and I want you to appreciate what a telegram meant in my life to that point. I had had 2 in my whole existence, one when my father died, and one when my sister's boy was born. And here was a man sending 3 in 20 minutes at 75 cents apiece like he was buying nails. One went to the Woodman of the World head office in Omaha. One went to the coroner of Riverside County, California. One went to the water district asking for the coroner's finding and stating, as they had requested, my interest. Then he leaned back and said the thing that changed the shape of the whole business. And he said it mildly, the way old men say the worst things. He said, "Now, Mrs. Bickford, I want you to consider something. A woman in California who wanted to take your husband's money did not need to write you 31 letters. She could have simply not written you anything. Not one word. You would have sat out there on that section waiting, and you would have gone on waiting a year, 2 years, and by the time you got up your nerve to go looking, it would all have been long done and nothing left to find. The letters were expensive to her. The letters were dangerous to her. She wrote them for 3 years and 8 months anyway." "Why?" I said I did not know. He said, "Because somebody had to be alive. Somebody had to be sending money home, so that the fact that no money was coming from anywhere else would not look like anything. And I have got a notion, and I would as soon be wrong, that there is a reason she needed you not just quiet, but alive in the wrong way. And we will find out what it is, and when we do, you are not going to like it." The answer from Omaha came on the 1st of July, and it came to Merritt Sharp's office, and he sent a boy out to the place for me on a bicycle in the heat, and I drove in with the wheat kneading cutting and the boy's bicycle in the back of the wagon. The Woodman of the World wrote that the benefit certificate of Orrin L. Bickford, camp number 1144, Fowler, Kansas, $1,000, was in force, the dues having been paid quarterly by postal money order without interruption through the current quarter. They wrote that a claim had been made upon that certificate on the 4th of April, 1934, by Miss Verna Bickford of Bakersfield, California, sister of the deceased. They wrote that in support of her claim, Miss Bickford had submitted a statement, subscribed and sworn, to the effect that the beneficiary named in the certificate, Nell Bickford, wife, had died of pneumonia in Kansas in March of 1933, some 5 months before the member himself, that the 2 minor children of the member were in her, Miss Bickford's, care in California, and that as their guardian and as next of kin, she requested payment of the benefit to herself. They wrote that the society, as was its practice where the named beneficiary was said to be deceased and no death certificate accompanied the claim, had required corroboration from the member's home camp and from a responsible officer of the community. They wrote that such corroboration had been received on the 22nd of May, 1934, in the form of a signed and witnessed statement from the postmaster at Fowler, Kansas, certifying of his own knowledge that Mrs. Nell Bickford, wife of Orrin Bickford of that vicinity, was deceased, and that her children had been sent to relatives in California. And they wrote that payment had nevertheless been held in abeyance, and remained so pending a certified copy of the beneficiary's death record, which Miss Bickford had twice promised and had not furnished. That the Society had written to her at intervals, and that under Section 14 of the Society's Constitution, no action upon a certificate could be maintained after 3 years from the date of the member's death, that date being the 11th of August, 1933. I read it standing up. I got to the words "the postmaster at Fowler, Kansas," and I put my hand out and took hold of the back of the chair. And Merritt Sharp did not get up and did not fuss. He just said, "Sit down, Mrs. Bickford." And I sat down. 2 years and 2 months that man had handed me my mail. He had said, "Well now, Miss Bickford, I believe there is something here for you." He had given my son peppermints. He had come out to my place with a ham when my father died. And on the 22nd of May, 1934, he had sat down at a desk behind that grill and written out, over his own signature and his own seal, that I was dead. Sharp let me sit there a minute. Then he said in the same mild voice, "Do you understand what he has done besides lie?" I said, "He has been taking my mail." He said, "He has been taking the United States mail, ma'am. That is not a Kansas matter, and it is not mine. That is the Post Office Department, and they have got their own inspectors, and I will tell you something about postal inspectors that will do you good on the nights when you cannot sleep. They do not care about your grief, and they do not care about your money. They care that a man wearing their badge behind their grill wrote a certificate saying a living woman on his route was dead. They will come out here for that if it is the last $5 in the treasury." I said, "Then send for one." He said, "I already have." Now here is the hard part, and I want you to look at me while I say it. It is the 2nd of July. That claim of hers has sat in Omaha for 2 years because she could not produce a death certificate for you, and she cannot produce one because you are sitting in my office. On the 11th of August, that certificate goes out of reach for her, and for you. She has been waiting for the one thing that would let her finish it, and you have got 40 days to make sure she does not get it. And if you are thinking that the safest thing for that woman right now would be for Nell Bickford of Meade County to genuinely die, then you and I have had the same thought. And I would like you to keep a lamp lit and a neighbor near. I drove home and cut wheat for 4 days with a neighbor's crew because the wheat did not care. And on the 7th of July, I did the thing I had been putting off, which was drive to Dodge City and knock on the door of a house on Trail Street and ask Dutch Ostrander why he had not looked me in the eye since 1934. He came to the door in his undershirt, and he saw me and his whole body changed. I have never had anything like it happen to me before or since. A big man of 40 going gray in the face on his own front step. He said, "Oh, Nell." He said it like a man being told the tumor is his. I said, "When did he die, Dutch?" And he said, "You know when." And I said, "Say it." He sat down on the step. He was 2 feet below me, and he stayed down there the whole time. And I let him. He said the 11th of August, 33, about 10:15 in the morning, and heading 4 east. A fall of ground about 11 feet of it, and that Orrin was not the only one. There was a Mexican boy named Chavarria killed with him, and that they got them out by 3 in the afternoon, and it was not. He stopped there and looked at his hands and said, "It was quick, Nell, and I will swear to that in any church you name." Then he told me the rest, and this is the part I had come for, and the part I have never gotten over. He said that on the 12th of August, 1933, he had walked 4 miles to a store at Hayfield and bought a tablet and an envelope and a stamp, and had sat outside that store and written to me. He said it took him 2 hours because he was not a writing man and because he had never had to say anything like that before, and that he had told me where and how and what time, and that he had said he would bring Orrin's things when he came home, and that he had asked me to have somebody with me when I read it. He said he mailed it that afternoon to Mrs. Nell Bickford, Fowler, Kansas, Route 1. He said that when he came home in the fall of '34, the first person he spoke to in Fowler was Wendell Pace, and Pace told him, leaning on the grill, friendly, sorrowful, that yes, poor Nell had had the letter and had taken it very hard, and had asked that nobody in the county speak to her about Orrin, not one word ever, because she could not bear it, and that the whole town was respecting her wishes. Dutch Ostrander sat on his step in Dodge City, Kansas, and said, "I thought I was doing what you wanted. I thought about you every Sunday for 2 years, and I thought I was doing what you wanted." I did not say anything for a while. There was a mockingbird going on in a tree in that yard, and I remember thinking that it was a lot of noise for such a small thing. Then I asked him if he still had Orrin's things. He said he never got them. A woman had come to the camp before he could, a Sunday, and had signed for the grip and the coat and the money, and that she was Orrin's sister, and that she had asked the timekeeper 2 questions, which the timekeeper had repeated in front of Dutch and 11 other men in a mess tent, and which Dutch Ostrander had remembered for 3 years without understanding what he was remembering. She had asked what a fatal accident paid, and she had asked whether the district paid it to the family or to the widow. I want to be careful here, because I have told this story a few times now, and I have learned that this is the place where people start to hate her, and I would rather they waited. I asked Dutch what she was like when she asked it, and he said she was crying. He said she was crying so hard the timekeeper had to give her his handkerchief, and that she had loved her brother. Anybody could see it, and that was why nobody thought a thing about the questions. And I said, "Dutch, do you know what she did about the answer?" And he said no. And I told him, sitting on his front step on Trail Street, that his letter had never come, that the same man who had told him I knew had certified in writing to a benefit society that I was dead, and that Verna Bickford had spent 34 months writing letters in my husband's name and mailing me $14 a month out of what she had gotten for him. Dutch Ostrander put his face in his hands. Then he stood up and went in the house without a word, and came back out with his hat and his keys and said, "I have got a truck and 11 days of pay coming, and I'm going out there with you." And I said, "No, you are not. You are going to sit down at that table and write out everything you just told me in your own hand and sign it in front of a notary. And then you are going to do it again on Thursday in front of a postal inspector, and then you are going to keep the 11 days. Because I will need somebody in this county who can put his hand on a Bible and say what time my husband died. And I cannot have him being a man who drove me to California." That was the 7th of July. I had 35 days. And on the 8th of July, the Water District's second letter came. And it was not thin. It had the coroner's finding in it, which I read once and then folded and did not read again for 11 years. And it had a copy of a voucher. And the voucher was for $2,340, being the death benefit payable under the Workmen's Compensation Law of the state of California, and it had been paid on the 9th of February 1934 to Miss Verna Bickford of Kentucky Street, Bakersfield, upon her sworn showing that she was a partially dependent sister, that the deceased had no wife living, and that the deceased's children were in her care and support. $2,340. I sat with that piece of paper on my kitchen table for a long time, with the lamp lit and the wheat cut, and my children 90 miles away at my sister's, and I did the sum, because I had been doing sums all my life, and it was the only thing my hands knew how to do. She had received $2,340 in February of '34. Out of it, she had bought a certain number of postal money orders, $14 at a time, 34 of them, $476, and she had mailed them to me with a letter in my husband's name, and she had paid $4.25 a quarter to keep a dead man's certificate alive so she could have the $1,000 too. And she had given some portion of it. I did not know how much yet, but I would, and it was $200, and it was paid in 3 parts. And the last part was paid in January of '35 to a soft man in Fowler, Kansas, who kept peppermints in a jar for my son. She had paid me my own husband's death money in installments for 3 years to keep me from finding out that he had died. That is the sentence. I have never found a way to make it shorter.
On Saturday, the 11th of July, I put on the good dress again and drove into Fowler at 11 in the morning, which is the hour when the store is fullest. And I want you to know that I chose that hour on purpose, and that I had thought about it for 2 days. Merritt Sharp had told me not to. He said, "Let the inspector do it, Mrs. Bickford. You go in there and say one word wrong, and his lawyer will have you on the stand about it in April." And I said, "Mr. Sharp, that man has been handing me my life through a hole in a wall for 3 years. And he looked at me a while, and then said, "Well, do not accuse him of the mail. The mail is theirs. Accuse him of me." There were 9 or 10 people in that store. Ada Castile was at the dry goods counter with 2 of her girls. Old Mr. Renfrew was sitting by the stove that was not lit, the way he did all summer.
There was a boy at the grill buying a 2-cent stamp, and there was Wendell Pace behind it in his shirt sleeves with his sleeve garters on, whistling something. I got in line behind the boy. I waited my turn. That was the part I had rehearsed hardest, the waiting, because everything in me wanted to walk straight at him, and I knew that a woman who walks straight at a man in a store is a scene, and a woman who stands quietly in line is a witness. The boy took his stamp and went. I stepped up to the grill. Wendell said, "Well now, Miss Bickford, I believe there is," and I said, "Wendell, on the 22nd of May, 1934, you signed a statement for the Woodmen of the World in Omaha, Nebraska, certifying of your own knowledge that I was dead." The store did not go quiet all at once. That is a thing they put in books. What happened was that it went quiet in pieces. The 2 Castile girls first, then Ada, then the man weighing nails, and by the time it was all the way quiet, I had already said the second sentence, which was, "You certified that Nell Bickford of this vicinity was deceased, and that her children had been sent to relatives in California, and you put your name and your seal on it, and you sent it to a benefit society so that Verna Bickford could collect $1,000 on my husband's certificate. My husband was killed in a tunnel in California on the 11th of August, 1933. You knew that too. Dutch Ostrander wrote me a letter about it on the 12th of August, 1933, and he mailed it from Hayfield, California to this office. Wendell Pace's face went through 3 things in about 2 seconds. It went to the pleasant look first, out of habit, the way a hand goes to a hat. Then it went white in a band across the top, under the hair, which I have never seen on anybody else in my life. Then it settled into a thing I can only call administrative. The face of a man behind a counter dealing with a person who has become a problem. He said, "Mrs. Bickford, you are overwrought." And I said, "I have been overwrought since the 25th of June. Before that, I was lied to." He said, "I do not know anything about any society in Omaha." And I said, and this is the only line I had written down beforehand and carried in my glove, and I have never been sorry that I did. I said, "Then you will not mind explaining that to the man from the post office department who is coming out here on Tuesday. He is going to want to know how a postmaster comes to certify the death of a woman who has been coming into his office every first Saturday for 3 years to get her mail. You wrote out that I was dead, Wendell. I have come in to sign for my mail." Nobody in that store said one word. Ada Castile told me 2 years afterward that she stood there with her hand on a bolt of gingham and could hear the fan. Wendell Pace said in a voice that had gone up about half a note, "Now, Nell." And I said, "Mrs. Bickford." I turned around and walked out. My legs did not fail me until I was in the wagon and around the corner by the elevator. And then they went to water, and I sat there and shook for 10 minutes with the reins in my lap. And old Mr. Renfrew came out and stood a way off and did not say anything. And after a while he said, "Your daddy would have liked that," and went back in. The postal inspector came on Tuesday the 14th. His name was Elgin Marsh, and he was about 40 and had a hat that had been brushed and a way of writing that never stopped. And he was in Fowler 4 days. He did not come out to my place to comfort me, and he did not once say he was sorry about my husband. And I have thought about that since and decided it was the kindest thing anybody did for me that whole summer. He asked me questions in Merritt Sharp's office for 5 hours with a stenographer from the courthouse, and about the 4th hour he asked me to describe, with dates, every occasion in 3 years on which Wendell Pace had said anything at all to me about my husband. And I found that I could, that I had every one of them, that they were sitting in me like stones in a jar. And when I got to, "You want to give a letter to California 10 days, Miss Bickford?" Elgin Marsh stopped writing and looked up and said, "He said that to you before or after you mailed it?" And I said after he had it in his hand. And he wrote that down and underlined it twice. And that underlining was worth 2 years of a man's life. They took the certification out of the Society's file in Omaha and put it beside the specimen signature card from the Fowler office. They found, in a locked drawer in Wendell Pace's own desk, 11 pieces of mail addressed to me that had never been delivered. The oldest postmarked Hayfield, California, the 12th of August, 1933. Dutch Ostrander's letter was still sealed. I have it now. I did not open it for 4 years, and when I did, I found that he had spelled tunnel with 1 N and had written at the bottom under his name, "He had your picture in his coat," and I made sure it went in the box with his other things. And they found the money orders, $200 in 3 payments from V. Bickford, Bakersfield, California, to Wendell Pace personally in September of '34, in November of '34, and in January of '35, which was 5 months before he stood on my porch and told me my father's ham was the least he could do. $200. I have been asked more times than I can count what I think about that number, and here is my answer. It is not that it was little, it is that it was enough. Whatever it costs to buy a man like that, somebody found it out and paid it. and there is no arrangement I could make with the world that would let me stop knowing that. Now I have to tell you about the letter that came from Bakersfield on the 21st of July, because that is the day I found out who I was dealing with. It came to Merritt Sharp's office, addressed to him, and it was 3 pages in a good hand on good paper, and it was signed, Verna. And it was, I want to be honest, a beautiful letter. It was better than anything I could have written. It began by saying that she had had the news from Kansas and that she was glad, she wrote it, that it was finally out, because she had not had one full night's sleep since August of '33. It said that when the district sent for her, she had gone out to the desert alone and had been handed her only brother's coat, and that on the drive home, she had decided that Nell must not be told all at once, that Nell had 2 babies and no crop and no money and the wind taking the ground, and that a telegram from California would kill her. It said she had meant to write me the truth in the spring. It said the spring came, and she could not. It said the letters got easier, and that was the worst part, and she knew it. It said she had sent me every dollar she could spare and would swear to that. And then on the 3rd page, it said that she had taken advice and that the compensation money had been paid to her lawfully by the state of California on a finding she had not written herself, and that the certificate in Omaha was a family matter and ought to stay a family matter, and that if I would sign the enclosed paper, releasing her from any claim and stating that I had been aware of my husband's death and had consented to the arrangement, she would send me $800, 300 of it enclosed herewith in the form of a draft, the balance in October, and we could keep the whole thing from becoming a public disgrace to a family that had enough sorrow in it already. $300 was in that envelope. I had never seen a draft for $300, and I want to tell you the truth about the 10 minutes after Merritt Sharp read that letter out loud in his office with the fan going, because those 10 minutes are the reason I can look at myself. I wanted it. God forgive me, I wanted it. $300 in July of 1936 on a Kansas farm was the note at the bank, and a winter, and shoes, and a windbreak of trees on the north, and it was now, and it was without a courtroom, and without my children hearing their aunt's name in a hallway, and without Ada Castile's girls telling it at school. I sat in that chair, and I did the arithmetic, and the arithmetic said, take it, and the arithmetic was right. Then Merritt Sharp said, you do understand what she is asking you to sign. And I said, a release. And he said, no, ma'am. Look at the wording. She is asking you to swear that you knew all along. If you sign that, then every letter she wrote in that man's name for 34 months becomes a thing you agreed to. She does not want your peace, Mrs. Bickford. She wants your consent. Backdated. She wants it on paper that the woman who read those letters to her children beside a schoolhouse knew they were false when she read them. And I will tell you why she wants it. Because if you did not know, then she is a forger. And if you did know, then she is a sister who was carrying a hard secret for a widow who asked her to. He put the paper down and said, she is not buying the money. She has got the money. She is buying your children's memory of you. I have never been able to explain what that did to me. I have never entirely gotten it into words. The best I can do is this. Everything that had been grief up to that moment turned over and became work. I said, send it back. He said, all of it. And I said all of it. And then I said, no, wait. and I took the draft and I looked at it a while, and then I put it back in the envelope, because I had thought for 1 second about how it would feel to tear it in half in front of a lawyer, and I decided that I was not going to do a single thing in this business for how it would feel. We sent it back by registered mail with a letter of 1 paragraph which said that Mrs. Bickford declined, that a claim would be presented to the society before the 11th of August, and that all further communication was to be to counsel. And on the 24th of July, the Woodman of the World, Sovereign Camp, wrote to Merritt Sharp that a person representing herself to be the guardian of the minor children of the deceased member had, on the 20th, presented at their offices in Omaha a certified transcript of a record of death of one Nell Bickford, Meade County, Kansas, March 1933, together with a demand for immediate payment of the certificate, and that the society, having in hand both that document and Mr. Sharp's letter of the 2nd, and being unwilling to pay twice, would hold the matter for hearing before the officers of the Sovereign Camp at 10 o'clock in the morning on Monday, the 10th of August, 1936, at which time all persons claiming an interest might appear, and after which, the 3-year limitation falling on the 11th, the society would consider the certificate closed forever. She had gotten a death record for me. To this day, the state of Kansas has no idea how, and the state of Kansas's theory, which I believe, is that a clerk in a county I have never been to accepted an affidavit and $1 in 1934 from a woman in mourning who said her sister-in-law had died at home and was buried on the place, which was a thing that still happened in those years, and wrote it in the book. There was a record in this world that said I died in March of 1933. My children had been recorded as orphans in Omaha, Nebraska for 2 years and 3 months. And on the 10th of August, 600 miles from my kitchen, a room full of men in a society's front office was going to decide once and for all whether a piece of paper that said I was dead was worth more than a woman standing in front of them saying she was not. I had 17 days. I will pass over most of them. I cut and hauled and sold the wheat, which made 12 bushels to the acre, and paid the note at the bank in Meade in full for the first time in 9 years. And that is a paragraph I could have written a whole story about in another life, and it did not seem worth the ink that month. I got Dutch Ostrander's affidavit and the timekeeper's deposition from California by wire and by mail. I got Ada Castile and old Mr. Renfrew and Dr. Hollenbeck and the county clerk and the man at the elevator to swear that I had been alive and in Meade County continuously since 1901, which is a strange thing to have to prove, and which I did not find funny at the time, and have never entirely found funny since. Elgin Marsh gave us a certified copy of the Fowler certification and of the 3 money orders, on the condition that we would not use the word indictment out loud, which is how I learned that Wendell Pace was going to be indicted. And on the night of the 8th of August, the night before Merritt Sharp and I got on the train at Dodge City, I did not sleep. And I am going to tell you how I spent it, because I have found in my life that it is the nights before and not the days of that a person is actually made out of. I sat at my kitchen table with the lamp and the Arbuckle tin, and I took out all 34 letters and I read them one more time, in order, from Needles in October of 32 to the last one in June of 36. The first 3 were my husband. You could hear him. The country out here is the ugliest thing God ever made, and there is a man in this camp from Protection, Kansas, who says different. And I have quit talking to him. And the 4th, and the 5th, and on to the 16th, and then the 16th was written on the 2nd of August, 1933, and it said the hand was fine. The hand was nothing, and that he had figured he could come home at Christmas with $280 if the tunnel held, and that Clem was to keep her feet dry, and kiss them for me, and mind the wind. 9 days. And then the 17th, in a neat, slanted hand, telling me about the school teacher out of Missouri. I sat there for a long time with those 2 letters side by side, and what I felt was not what I expected. What I felt at 2 in the morning at my own kitchen table was that the woman who wrote the 17th letter had had to sit down somewhere and read the first 16. She had had to study my husband. She had had to learn how he ended a letter and what he called his daughter, and that he never asked questions. And then she had had to decide in cold blood to become him for as long as it took. That is not a lie told to spare somebody. A lie told to spare somebody is short. That is an occupation. I put the letters back in the tin. I put the tin in the grip with the good dress and the Water District's letter and the coroner's finding and the pantry door, which Merritt Sharp had taken off its hinges himself with a screwdriver on the Thursday and wrapped in a quilt, and which we carried through the Dodge City Depot at 6 in the morning, like 2 people moving a body. Then I stood at the east window and drank a cup of coffee looking at the ground, and the sun came up, and I said, out loud in an empty kitchen, "All right, Orrin. I am going after your wages." The offices of the Sovereign Camp were on the 4th floor of a stone building in Omaha, Nebraska, with a marble floor in the lobby and a directory in gold letters and an elevator run by a boy in a uniform. And I had never been in an elevator in my life. Merritt Sharp carried the grip. I carried the pantry door and the quilt, and when the elevator boy offered to take it from me, I said, "No, thank you." And he looked at Sharp, and Sharp said, "Son, that is evidence." And the boy did not say another word to either of us the whole way up. The room they put us in had a long table and 11 chairs and a portrait of a man with a beard, and there were 4 officers of the society and the society's attorney, whose name was Ketchum, and a stenographer and a clerk with a file box. And at the far end of the table, in a good gray traveling suit with black at the collar, sat my husband's sister, with a lawyer from Bakersfield beside her, whose name I never learned because he never gave it to me. Verna had come in on the Rock Island the night before. We had come in on the Burlington. We had been within 9 blocks of each other in a strange city all night, and neither of us knew it. And I have thought about that too. I want to describe her exactly. She was 45, and she was thinner than the last time I saw her, and she had done something to her hair, and she looked well. That is the thing I was not prepared for. I had spent 5 weeks with a picture in my head of a woman who had not slept since August of '33. And here was a handsome woman in a good suit with her hands folded. And when I came into that room, she looked up at me, and her face did not do one single thing. It did not go white. It did not crack. She looked at me the way you look at weather you have been expecting. The attorney Ketchum called it to order and said that the society had before it 2 claims upon certificate number 1144-B in the sum of $1,000, and that it proposed to hear them both, and that the society was not a court and made no pretense of being one, but that the certificate would be paid to the person entitled to it and to no one else, and that the limitation ran the following day at midnight. Verna's lawyer went first. He was smooth, and it took him 9 minutes. He said that Miss Bickford had been the sole support and comfort of her late brother, that she had been named by the district and had signed for his effects, that the beneficiary of record, the wife, had died in Kansas in March of 1933, of which there was now a certified transcript of record before the officers, that the minor children had been in Miss Bickford's care and support since, and that any person appearing now, 3 years and 1 day after the member's death, claiming to be a woman who had a death record on file in her own county, was a matter for the courts of Kansas and not for the officers of a fraternal society, and that the society's duty was to the paper. The society's duty was to the paper. He said it twice. I have never forgotten it, and I have come to think it is the truest sentence anybody said that morning, and that the whole of my summer was the work of getting a piece of paper louder than a woman. Then Merritt Sharp stood up, and he did not go 9 minutes. He said, "Gentlemen, my client is the beneficiary named on your certificate. She is 35 years old, and she is standing at the end of this table. I am going to ask you to look at her, and then I am going to ask you to look at 4 things, and then I am going to sit down." He laid them out in a row on that table like a man playing a hand. The letter from the Metropolitan Water District with the date and the heading and the name of the man who signed for the effects. The affidavit of Dutch Ostrander of Dodge City, Kansas, with the timekeeper's deposition attached, saying at what hour my husband died and what Verna Bickford asked in a mess tent about what a fatal accident paid. The certified copy, furnished by the Post Office Department, of a statement over the hand and seal of the postmaster at Fowler, Kansas, dated the 22nd of May, 1934, certifying my death, with, clipped to it, photostats of 3 postal money orders totaling $200, drawn by V. Bickford of Bakersfield, California, payable to Wendell Pace personally in September and November of 1934 and January of 1935. And then Merritt Sharp unwrapped a quilt on the table of the sovereign camp of the woodmen of the world and stood a pantry door up against the wall, with its hinges still on it, and the paint worn where a woman's hand had pushed it for 30 years, and the pencil marks running down the stile. The well deepened, my father dead, Clemmy 4 feet 1. And near the bottom in my hand, dated the 30th of May, 1936. Letters not like him after August 33. He said, "That is written 26 days before she learned her husband was dead. Gentlemen, I have practiced law in Kansas for 39 years, and I have never had a client I could prove was honest. I have got one now." Then Ketchum turned to me and said the officers would hear me, and asked me to state my name. And I said the only thing I had planned, which was this. I said, "My name is Nell Bickford. I am the woman that document says is dead. That paper was bought for $1 in a county I have never set foot in, by the woman at the other end of this table, so that she could finish taking my husband's money, and I have come 600 miles to sign for my own death. Hand me the pen and I will sign it. And when I have signed it, ask her one question. Ask her who wrote my children a letter from their father on Christmas Eve of 1933, 4 months after he was buried. And ask her to say it out loud in this room." Nobody spoke. There was a kind of quiet where you can hear a life coming apart, and I have been in the room for it twice now, and the second time was that one, and it was not mine. Verna's lawyer started to say that his client would not be examined here, and Verna put her hand on his arm, not fast, not dramatic, and moved it about an inch, the way you move a cat off a chair, and said, "Sit down, Howard." Then she looked down the length of that table at me and said, "I did." Ketchum said, "Miss Bickford, I would advise," and she said, "I wrote all of them. I wrote them at my kitchen table on Kentucky Street, and I mailed them from the box on the corner. I wrote the Christmas ones in October because the mail is slow at Christmas." She was not looking at the officers. She was looking at me and only at me, and her voice was perfectly level. And I understood, watching her, that she had rehearsed this too. Not this room, but this moment, some version of it in her head for 3 years, the way I had rehearsed the store in Fowler. She said, "I took his coat off a nail in a tent, and I signed for $11 and his hat and a photograph of you. And I drove back to Bakersfield, and I got to Mojave, and I pulled off the road, and I sat in the car until it was dark. And what I thought about, Nell, was not the money. It was that there was not one thing in this world you could do about it. You had no money to come out. You had no man to send.
You did not know one soul in that state but me. And I sat there in the dark and I thought, she is going to believe whatever I tell her forever. And it is going to be up to me. And I would like to tell these gentlemen that a thing like that is a burden. It was not a burden. It was the first power I ever had in my life. And I took it. And I used it for 3 years, and I would be using it yet if the post office had not changed the color of its paper. Her lawyer had both hands over his face. She said, "I paid you $14 a month because I could not stand it otherwise. That is the truth, and it is not a good truth. And the rest of it I spent. And I will tell you what I spent it on, since there is a stenographer. $200 to Wendell Pace, a parlor set, a Chevrolet coach, $400 and some in San Francisco in April, and a good many dinners. There is a little over $300 left, and I sent it to you in July, and you sent it back." And then she said the last thing she ever said to me, and it was, "You were always going to be all right now. You have got a face people believe. I have not." The officers went out of the room for 11 minutes. When they came back, the presiding officer said that the claim of Verna Bickford was denied and stricken, that the certificate would be paid in the sum of $1,000 to Nell Bickford, beneficiary of record, upon proof of identity which the officers found to have been abundantly furnished, that the society would forward the whole of its file, including the transcript of record presented on the 20th of July, to the county attorney of Douglas County, Nebraska, and to the district attorney of Kern County, California, and that the society thanked Mr. Sharp for the loan of the door and would require it no further. I signed 4 papers. My hand was steady. I have got a photograph of the check somewhere, because Merritt Sharp made me have one taken at a place on Farnham Street, and in it I am wearing an 8-year-old hat, and I am not smiling, and I look, my daughter says, like a woman who has been up since 3. Now I will tell you what became of them, because you have earned it. Wendell Pace was indicted in the fall of 1936 in the federal court at Wichita on 4 counts, and the one that finished him was not the $200. It was the 11 pieces of mail in his desk drawer. He pleaded to 2 counts in January of 37 and got 18 months at Leavenworth and lost his office, his bond, and every dollar of the pension he had been counting for 17 years. He came back to Kansas in 38 and worked as a night watchman at a grain elevator at Buckland, 30 miles east, where the mail he saw came addressed to nobody. He wrote me one letter from Leavenworth. I did not open it, and I did not throw it away. It is in a box with the tax receipts, and I expect one of my grandchildren will open it someday and think worse of me for not having. Verna was tried in Bakersfield in the spring of 1937, and the compensation people came at her from one side and the district attorney from the other, and she pleaded to forgery and to perjury and served 22 months at Tehachapi. The state of California took a judgment against her for the $2,340, and she paid it at $11 a month for the rest of her natural life, out of wages, and I will tell you what her work was. She kept house. She kept house for other women in Bakersfield, women who had their own parlor sets. There is a word for how the punishment fits the crime, and I have never used it out loud about my husband's sister, and I am not going to start tonight. But I have thought it, and I thought it every October when the $11 came. She never wrote to me again, and I never wrote to her.
I got the $1,000 in September of 1936, and the 2,340 came to me out of California in pieces over 9 years and was, by the end, mostly gone in the getting. I paid Merritt Sharp $400, and he tried to give back $150 of it, and I would not let him. I put trees on the north, Chinese elm, 206 of them, set out in the spring of '37 with the children carrying water. And I put a new roof on the house, and I bought a milk cow and a used Ford truck, and I put $600 in the bank at Meade, where it sat and did nothing but let me sleep, which is the best return money has ever paid me.
I want to finish with 3 things. The first is that in November of 1939, a parcel came to my mailbox on Route 1, wrapped in butcher paper and tied with cotton string, mailed from Bakersfield with no return address, and in it was Orrin's good coat. It had been cleaned. There was no letter, no card, nothing written anywhere on it or in it, and I have never known, and never will, whether that was the last cruelty or the only apology. I hung it in the kitchen on the 3rd nail by the door, which had been his nail, and it hung there for 11 years, and my son wore it to his own wedding in 1951, with the sleeves let out an inch. The second is that the Arbuckle tin is on the shelf over the sink in this house, right now. The letters are not in it. The letters went to the federal court at Wichita in 1936, and I never asked for them back, and I have never once wanted them. And if you take one thing from a woman who has thought about this for 20 years, take that. The things that hurt you are not always yours to keep. What is in the tin now is a photograph of 206 little elms, about as high as a boy's knee, and $11 in an envelope that came from California in the last October she was alive, which I did not spend and could not send back, and the receipt for the roof. And the third is this. For a long while after, the thing that would come on me without warning was not the tunnel and it was not the coat. It was the doorway. My husband standing there with his hat on, half in and half out of my kitchen, saying he was not wearing it, he was carrying it. I could not have that memory for years without the rest of it coming. Fresno, Bakersfield, 110 miles of valley, a woman at a table on Kentucky Street, learning how to be him. It came back to me clean about 5 years ago. I was in the kitchen before daylight with the lamp lit and the fire catching and the coffee ground, and I looked at that doorway, and there he was, hat and all, and there was nothing else in it, just my husband in the door, being funny about a hat, in a house he paid for with his back and his life, and never got to see the trees of. I finished the coffee. I stood at the east window and looked at the ground the way he used to, and the ground was mine, and the wind came out of the northwest and hit 206 elms before it ever got to my house. Well, friends, that is where the story leaves us. And I have a question for you before you go. Verna Bickford said she wrote those letters because she could not stand the alternative. And she also said the money was hers to spend. And both of those things came out of the same mouth in the same minute. So tell me, do you think there was ever a day in those 3 years when she could have stopped and written the truth? Or did the second letter make the third one certain, and the 10th make the 30th? Tell me what you think in the comments. I read every one of them. Thank you for staying with me all the way to the end tonight. There should be a playlist coming up on your screen with more stories from this channel, and I would be glad if you stayed a while longer.